So I hope that everybody's had a decent extra week of not Zooming. Um, Again, I apologize for making the last minute call to cancel. I just had something personal pop up and I had to leave town to visit with a family member that needed me to do something. Um, so it wasn't anything terrible, but like there's just no way to be in town and then make it to do the thing that I needed to do. I apologize for that last minute cancellation. But we'll handle everything this week. Um, I wanted to start out by saying that I really liked reading all of your tests. I can tell that like y'all put a ton of quality time into writing your answers out. I still have a lot of comments to upload, but all of the grades are good, so don't sit there and stress about them or anything. You will have them tonight, I swear on it. Okay. Um, Again, it just took me a little longer. I like reading through and actually considering everything that everybody's saying and trying to make sure that I give everything fair consideration. And that sometimes takes me a little longer than if I were just grading like a regular test that didn't have two rather large essays on it. Okay. So I appreciate you, just putting up with me taking a little extra time, but they will be up tonight, grades and comments, I promise you. Um, if you don't have them already, some of you already have them. Okay, so I wanted to start out and just say as well, like, we're coming toward the part of the semester where we need to start thinking about our final projects and what we might want to write about. So one of the things that I've done is I've geared the VoiceThread assignment that was originally due this weekend, but I wanted to switch it up and kind of work on something different from what we had been doing in that assignment. So it's actually going to be due next Wednesday. And if you get it in like a little after that, that's fine as well. Um, but what we'll do is just on that VoiceThread assignment, think about, and I've got this on there so you can listen to me talk about it. Think about like a show or shows you are actually interested in exploring something around and what that might be, just thinking out loud. Um, I've also decided, and I was going to tell you all this last week before I canceled, but um, along with my media theory class at Georgia State, I've decided that because I can do this with you and them and it be productive and actually do something, that I'm going to write a paper with y'all for the final. So I'll go through all of the same steps, submitting a proposal and getting feedback from y'all on different things. And then you can kind of see what that process is like for me, right? So I don't know, I thought it might be an interesting experiment. I've never done anything like this before, but I want you all to know like it can be done, and your professors are people who have to write things all the time. And I don't want you to feel like I'm asking y'all to do stuff that we're not expecting ourselves to be able to do. So I haven't done it in a while. I haven't been in school in a while, so it's a little terrifying for me as well to do something on like a 3 to 4 week period. But we'll see how it goes. So you'll get to experience my own terror alongside yours. Okay. Um, all right. So we have quite a lot of ground to cover. I hope everybody was able to at least watch the lecture videos that kind of contextualized a lot of cultural issues, as well as like regulations like the financial syndication rule and primetime access rule that were important to this era of the network system and network programming strategies in particular. But I did want to open the floor because it has been a little bit of time since we've actually seen one another face to face, and see if y'all had specific questions you wanted answered or things you didn't quite understand. Again, your textbook does a really good job of summarizing a whole lot of stuff, but I just want to make sure before we dive into talking about the TV shows that we watched, that you don't have any kind of lingering questions about big items. So if anybody has a question, feel free to chime in or type it into the chat. And you can, of course, ask them as we go along. Like if something comes up while we're talking about one of these shows, feel free to ask as well. Okay. So does anybody have anything to start off with? Is everything mostly clear from readings and lecture videos? Okay. Well, let's start by just talking about TV shows. We watched a lot of stuff over the last couple of weeks. Last week, kind of everything was themed around science fiction programs, and at least two of them were shows that probably all of you had heard of before, if not watched. So Twilight Zone and Star Trek. And then one is kind of a big, important show that is not as well known now as a TV show, although there was a not quite great Tim Burton movie a few years back, a while back now. I keep saying a few years, it's probably closer to 10. But I'm curious your thoughts on Twilight Zone and Star Trek in particular, since those are often categorized as like, high level science fiction texts for TV history. Just what your thoughts on the episodes we watched are. Have you seen those shows before? Anything at all? Anybody want to start out the discussion? I can start talking about Twilight Zone. So, had y'all seen Twilight Zone before? Maybe the new one you'd watched. Probably not many of you. CBS All Access did not have a huge subscriber base, and Jordan Peele's iteration of that show was canceled after 2 seasons. Twilight Zone ran for a long time on TV, and then in syndication for a long time. And as a cultural text, it has like a very wide imprint. So, without the Twilight Zone being kind of exactly what it was and as popular as it was, we might not have gotten shows like The X-Files. And then without The X-Files and things like that, right, we wouldn't have gotten Supernatural or Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So all of this goes back to kind of this moment when, the Twilight Zone kind of has this level of prestige that is tied to TV anthology dramas, which are all those kind of one-off plays that they're producing. Rod Serling, who writes and he hosts the Twilight Zone, comes out of that kind of playwriting for television circle, and he actually writes the majority of the Twilight Zone's episodes, although he does not direct them. So it kind of has this level of prestige right off the gate because people know who Rod Serling is. He had had some success with other programs, and it's kind of this show that has a very, very long legacy. There was another reboot of the show in the 1980s, and then the most recent one with Jordan Peele, right? So you can kind of see with somebody like Jordan Peele, it's again an appeal to kind of that legacy of kind of high quality produced drama, right? Somebody who's established within the industry, who's considered to have an authorial voice and that sort of thing. Let's see. Maddie says, seen some older older Twilight Zone episodes in high school classes, but not the one we watched for class. That's interesting. This is actually one of the canonical episodes, but it's probably not as famous as like there's the bottle episode. There's also I always forget the name, but it's the one where the doctor and the nurse have the pig noses and they've operated on people, right? Kaylin says, used to be on Netflix and might have been more easily accessible and commercial free to watch a few years ago. Certainly. As we get toward the end of the semester, what you'll start seeing is that for a variety of reasons, having mostly to do with, post-cable networks, so kind of the advent of streaming, a lot of what started to happen, as you're all well aware, probably just, from the number of services you have to have just to watch random stuff. All of these shows that are owned by the networks have started to be siloed within their proprietary streaming services, right? So if you want to watch the Twilight Zone, you can watch it on Hulu. Or you can watch it on CBS All Access, which is now Paramount Plus. I have to remember that. It's a terrible name, Paramount Plus, because nobody recognizes Paramount anymore. It's not like a huge studio name. It's not like the 1990s, when it was, the studio that made Top Gun and Mission Impossible and all that. So what did y'all think of the monster? Sorry, I forget the monsters are due on Maple Street. I have to look at it real quick.
When I started watching it, I kind of immediately knew that they're gonna like have a twist to it. And it was gonna be like there wasn't really a monster there, and that they're trying to kind of get at like the people are the monster themselves. And so I was watching it with my mom, and we were trying to guess like who are they gonna pick to like be the monster next, and who's gonna go after who. And it was kind of fun to do that with her.
Yeah, and it also like conforms to some of the rules of like late 50s and early 60s sci-fi. I mean, this is a little later, but um of where like everything's an allegory for like the Red Scare, like the communist witch hunt kind of thing. Everybody going after their neighbor as opposed to, focusing on what actual issues are facing the country. And the Twilight Zone did that repeatedly. I mean, that was kind of its whole shtick, was that by the end of every episode, somebody learned a moral lesson, even if it didn't end well for them necessarily. Um, so it's interesting to see like everybody still understands that and like does not expect there to actually be monsters that show up on screen. Um, and of course, there were usually not monsters on the screen for Twilight Zone because it did not have a very big budget. So those things cost money. So you got things with like people with pig noses and stuff, but otherwise pretty tame. Um, let's see. Allison says in the chat that they were excited for the Jordan Peele version, but a little disappointed and didn't continue watching after episode 1. I think that's the case for a lot of people. I watched the whole first season, and the last episode's really interesting. It gets really weird and meta. Um, it's about a woman who works on the Twilight Zone, being followed around the studio and like through her life by this shadow man. And then spoiler alert here, if you ever go back and watch it, it turns out that like the shadow man is Rod Serling. Like stalking her around, and it gets really weird and meta. But yeah, probably the show that does a better version than Jordan Peele's Twilight Zone did of what like the Twilight Zone was doing is something like Black Mirror, at least for its first couple seasons on Netflix. Bella says in the chat, I thought it was a really interesting demonstration of human paranoia and the danger it can lead to. For sure. And Serling was all about exploring that. Any final thoughts on Twilight Zone? I don't want us to feel like we're super rushed, but we got like 8 shows to talk about. It's a lot for 1 week.
With the Twilight Zone, I feel like me saying something is scary doesn't necessarily mean it's scary because I'm just easily jump scared and think everything is scary. But I watched it like in the dark at like 5:30 in the morning because that's just when I end up doing these screenings sometimes. And it was like Allison said in the chat, it was eerie. And I was anticipating that monster on the screen the whole time and kind of waiting for that jump scare. So I was really tense for the entire like 25-30 minutes of the program.
Yeah, it's very good at building up that tension, I think. And it delivers on it, but not necessarily in the way that we might think all the time that it's going to deliver on it, right? So the thing we're end up being shown is not, some crazy ghoul or something. Catherine, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the episode that my parents like made me watch probably like 5-10 years ago was one where aliens are coming and eventually they are on screen and they have a cookbook for how to cook humans. And that was like my only experience with this show. So I was kind of expecting the same thing as Kaylin, where eventually they do show up with like, crazy consequences.
Yeah, that one. That's when the aliens have like the weird foreheads, right? If I'm remembering correctly. It's been a while since I've watched all of this
Yeah.
stuff, but like that, the revelation that they have this cookbook for humans, but that the for humans part is like how to cook humans kind of thing. Um, yeah, it does in some episodes. It does do like here are the monsters on screen, but it still will twist a little bit, I think, as you're pointing to, right? So it comes with this initial premise of these aliens visiting Earth, and then it kind of like changes at the last minute a little bit. Mateo, go ahead.
I thought it was interesting watching this because it's like if I based on like older shows I've seen, I feel like this episode of the Twilight Zone particularly had some really uh some camera work that stood out for a TV show because I haven't really seen shows back then with camera work as dynamic as this one had, especially at the end, I think.
Yeah, and they were, coming out of that those anthology shows where, every episode was basically just an hour-long play that they had shot. Kind of established the rhythm for how they would shoot a lot of these episodes too. So it does play a little more what we might, in common parlance call cinematically than like a 3-camera setup would, like you would see for your sitcoms and your soap operas. And I think that definitely contributes a little bit to kind of both its perceived, in quotes, quality of the program, as well as kind of like we pay a little more attention to stuff like that and kind of its style of how it tells the story. Any other thoughts on the Twilight Zone? Well, let's talk about Star Trek for a minute. We watched one of the famous episodes. It's one of the really big ones from the original series called Arena. And any Trekkers in here? I find there are fewer and fewer of them as we get along, but I think it's because you're not exposed to it in syndication like everybody else and their mother was. So Star Trek, when it originally aired in the 1960s, was not that popular. It's actually one of the first series that had massive write-in campaigns from fans of the show to get it renewed, because it was, people figured that out. That's how fanatical some of the fans were, but it was relatively cheap to produce, as you could probably tell on screen. And so the network like just kind of kept it on for 3 seasons. But it was really in syndication when that show became very popular in the 1970s. And that's when you start having like fan conventions, and it eventually gets the movie series going. And then the movies become so popular that that's when they decide, like in the 1980s, like to do the Next Generation, and it kind of revives the franchise. And from there, it remains pretty popular. So, and it kind of had this second life on television and then developed into something that was really big, which I always find really interesting when things happen like that. For whatever reason, just didn't catch on at the time. So any Star Trek fans in here? Had y'all seen Star Trek stuff before in general? Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, the movies with like one of the Chris's in it? A little bit
Only on Futurama.
on Futurama.
Yeah, they like
Yeah.
I think frick. I don't know which one of these guys even is, but he has like a voice acting role there quite frequently, like pretty much every season. And I think there's like an entire episode that's on Star Trek specifically.
Yeah, for sure. And crap, what's that Seth MacFarlane show on? Do you know what I'm talking about? He has that sci-fi show that Seth MacFarlane, The Orville. That's what it is. The Orville is like basically Seth MacFarlane doing Star Trek the original series / Next Generation kind of combined. So it's a little corny, a little low tech special effects, but also trying to play around with it. So in Arena, we have kind of what was the format of Star Trek, kind of this problem of the week. Basically every Star Trek episode is premised around The Enterprise comes up against a threat to all life in the universe and then must figure out a way around it that, is for the betterment of humanity. So it takes place in kind of this semi-utopian future where, at least on Earth, there is no longer racism. There has been space exploration for quite some time, and we've established relationships with lots and lots of different alien races, many of them humanoid, and created this intergalactic alliance, the Federation. Maddie in the chat says, my dad's a fan. A few years ago, he was rewatching the entire series along with the podcast, so I've seen a few episodes from each iteration as he watched them and watched the movies with him. How did you feel about that, Maddie? Just randomly encountering Star Trek episodes.
It was interesting because for a while I thought they were all the same series because I just like pop in and out, and so it was like the ones with like data in it or whatever, and they had like the holodeck. I was like, oh, that's the same as the first one, and I'm like, they're not the same series, but they're interconnected as far as like story world. So I was like, I know more about the like holodeck type, like that iteration of it, because I've seen more of those. But I have seen some of the like originals with him because he's just like been watching them for like a really long time. So
yeah, all the holodeck stuff really comes around with like the Next Generation. But what happens with the Next Generation is since it becomes a franchise a few seasons in, there's a spin-off, Deep Space Nine, and then there's a sequel to like both of them that starts airing either in the last season of both Deep Space Nine or like just Deep Space Nine, Voyager. And all three of those shows have overlapping storylines. So yeah, people show up a lot. And of course, Deep Space Nine's an easy show to build a franchise around because it's a spaceport. And so like, of course, like the Enterprise can dock there, the Voyager can dock there, people can travel to and from, and so on. So that's really interesting that like that's your exposure, and it's kind of sort of random around this one concept, and then with your father, which is also like my entire, like I'm not a huge Trekkie. I've watched Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and most of Voyager, but I haven't watched any of the recent shows. The movies are fine. I don't like the original series that much. Mostly because, like, as you probably can tell from this episode, like it feels like it is dragging a little bit, right? Like there's a good 20 minutes of this 45-minute show that could just be like chopped out, probably. A lot of stuff like, hey, we're hanging out in the desert and we got to fill time. Let's see. Jacob has his hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I find Star Trek pretty interesting in the fact, I guess, it's like its impact. Like I think that each generation has its own sort of like way that they know it, or like thing that's positioned towards them. Like, when I first think Star Trek, I think of more of the modern version, modern actors. But then, when you ask someone who's older, let's say like a parent age, right? They're like, oh, the original one, or oh, the one that I saw, or when this actor used to be. Like, I just think that like there's that impact, as well as like it's created a pretty familiar structure and like genre of like this sort of space show, space exploration in a way. Right. And I think that that's like been a pretty positive impact for, let's say, the whole sci-fi world, as well as if you're like saying like Star Wars versus Star Trek, which one do you like better? Or there's like sort of the more modern take on it. I think there was like might have been like a Black Mirror sort of individual episode that had its own like take and own spin on it. So I think that it has like, I feel like I find its impact bigger than its actual like what it is as a content.
Yeah, and it also has like a lot of real world impact as well. So like, part of science fiction as a genre is that it's speculation into the future, and it's not so much that it's like, especially in shows like Star Trek, it's not that it's just imagining, it's not just pure fantasy. The idea is that you're going to imagine, based on where you are at any given moment, what a possible realistic extrapolation into the future might look like, right? And so in like the Next Generation, for example, you have like what these devices that very much are exactly like iPads, but it's like 25 years almost before the iPad is introduced into the market. But you know, they're playing around, they've got touch screens, all of this stuff. And just like that's a small iteration of something like that, but it's one of the more famous ones of kind of how the imaginative thinking of science fiction, especially with Star Trek, has influenced real world technology. So it's a show that has a lot of reach. When you
I just want to say that I actually heard of Star Trek at first in Big Bang Theory, like that TV show, and then like the really recent one, and then I watched like a few movies because I didn't really know anything about Star Trek or actually what movies are in America, and then when I watched this um decades ago Star Trek, I realized why in, for example, in Big Bang Theory, why these main characters were so obsessed with Spock, that I realized there's a whole history behind the recent movies. And also, I find it really interesting how um, the characters in this in Star Trek show is like they would the way they talk is very different. I wouldn't imagine like a recent movie a captain would say we will have to kill them because they did blank and blank. Also, like a minor detail, just I was a little confused when Captain talked into the translator thinking it was a record logging machine. I don't know the word for it, but like I think I also heard it before. Like the aliens were explaining to him it's a translator, but he still didn't realize that. I thought it was interesting to watch, honestly.
Yeah, anybody have thoughts on any of that stuff that when you just brought up? How did y'all feel watching the episode in general? What did you think of it, opinion wise? You gonna go back and watch more Star Trek after this? No, Caitlin's shaking her head. It's okay, you don't have to. I'm always just curious. Like I said, the original series is a very important show. It's not my favorite to deal with. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Dark Shadows. So I gave you kind of 2 episodes in a row of Dark Shadows to watch, hopefully to give you a little more of a feel for that show, right? Like I know we only saw 1 episode of Guiding Light, but since we listened to one as well, you had a little bit of like, at least you could understand like what this 15 minutes was going to be like. And so I wanted to have a similar experience with Dark Shadows. Now I'm going to ask you all the question: had y'all seen Dark Shadows before this? Anybody seen the movie version?
I saw the movie version.
Yeah, and how does it compare?
I would say like very different, just given they're like 5 decades apart.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you know, like we're also in the show at this point, it's really at the period where it starts to get supernatural in its story arcs. Like Barnabas Collins, the vampire, is just now being introduced into the story world. It had run before this and was just you know, it was your basic soap opera, but kind of set in this vaguely Victorian period house and setting, and vaguely Gothic styled, you know, doomed romance kind of storytelling. And then slowly over time, more and more supernatural stuff got added to it. So like you had Barnabas Collins the vampire, there were werewolves and ghosts and witches that all made appearances throughout the show's run. And it was on for quite a long time. What's interesting about Dark Shadows compared to like its more overtly romantic counterparts is that Dark Shadows ran later in the afternoon. So when, for instance, my stepfather would get home from middle and high school, it would be on. And so he became addicted to Dark Shadows. And so did like many younger men when they were in school. So it had a weird audience for a soap opera, where you had women who were invested because of the romantic storylines, but then because it was, you know, vampires and werewolves and ghosts and stuff, there were a lot of younger males who were tuning into the show literally every single day when they got home from school. and treating it, you know, like their story that they were interested in. So just a little odd background there. So first I want to ask, like, how did you feel about the structure of the show, at least in the 2 episodes that we watched? Did it feel like what you assumed a soap opera would feel like? What were the variations on what you assumed about the soap opera? That sort of thing. Did it conform to your expectations? And if
Kind
so,
of
in what?
felt
Yeah,
a
go
little
ahead.
disorienting at first because like it just the first episode kind of just puts you in on the story and it's like, okay, I don't really know why the like lady who owns the house doesn't like the boy that's staying there. I'm like, I'm not sure what their relationship kind of is. So I was just kind of a bit disoriented at first. And I was like waiting the entire first episode for the vampire to show up because I was like, okay, Dark Shadows is vampires. So I was like waiting for the vampire to show up. But it's also, compared to The Guiding Light, much more dynamic and movement of like sets and scenery. It was something that I noticed while watching it because I particularly The Guiding Light was like 2 sets, 2 still things. It was like much more dynamic and I found it a lot more easier to get into because it was more dynamic.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. One thing that's fun about Dark Shadows and kind of how, you know, adventurous they get with camera movement and sets and things like that compared to other soap operas of the time is that, like, because of that, if you watch the show fairly frequently, you'll notice weird things that kind of expose how cheap the production actually is, as because it's a soap opera, right? So like there are times when, like, because the camera is slightly offline of where it needs to be, you'll see Barnabas Collins like walk past the side of the set to get to the door that he needs to come through, and just all kinds of fun stuff like that. But it's because they're playing around with, like, okay, we can move the camera some more. We don't have to just sit here and have people talk in front of us like it's the radio show kind of thing, you know? So it's a fun show just to kind of like see all of the weird stuff that happens as a consequence of them playing around with that too. It's interesting that you note kind of feeling disoriented coming right in and like them starting in the middle of a storyline, because that's not uncommon for soap operas. Like they don't really give a whole lot of background detail season after season coming right in. But it's because there's also like this whole culture of texts around soap operas that like soap opera fans engage with constantly. So like if you've ever been in the grocery store in the checkout aisle and seen Soap Opera Digest, right? What that is it's a recap booklet of like all the ongoing storylines in every soap opera that's currently on air or in rerun that is airing that week, as well as a schedule for the upcoming week, so you can plan what it is you're going to watch. And in there, in addition to that material, there's like people writing letters to the editor and sharing their theories on things and talking about big twists. So there's this whole universe of text that actually exists outside of this, where people are keeping track of things going on. The industry is helping them keep track of it, so that if you come to something late, you can kind of jump in and figure out what the storylines are. So yeah, of course, it's a little disorienting getting in there, right? But it's just interesting that you point that out, because there is like this whole other thing going on that, of course, we're not looking at for various constraints. Like that stuff, especially from then, is relatively hard to find. You have to find fans who have scanned it and uploaded it to the internet most of the time. But yeah, if you're ever in the grocery store one day when you can spend some time touching things again, feel free to flip through one of those things and it'll be like, holy crap, everybody's like really into this. Soap opera fans are big into, into their fandom. Other thoughts on Dark Shadows? How'd y'all feel about it as a gothic or a horror text?
It felt
I had a
go ahead, Kaylin, and then I couldn't see who else was talking, but Kaylin first. Go ahead.
It was Nazario after me. I was just gonna say that it felt like a more serious version of the Addams Family, and I feel like kind of watching that the week before informed that opinion more so than maybe it actually being that way.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that. It is playing around with similar tropes, right? Like an inversion of kind of even though soap operas aren't always happy spaces like sitcoms are, it's an inversion of that kind of idealized wealth and commodity that, of course, soap operas traffic in, right? Like rich people and their, romantic endeavors and double crosses and murders and all of that stuff. And you said it was Nazario left after you? Go ahead.
Yeah. How was it normal for shows to still be in black and white at this time, or was this like for thematic purposes?
In the 1960s, yeah, for sure. TV really transitions into color kind of a little later than we think. I mean, like look, certain shows like Star Trek were shot in black and white or shot in color and aired in color, but there was a lot of weird technological stuff going on in the 1960s that kind of prevented everything from being in color. So if you remember reading from the book, it talks about this a little bit. Like there was actually a pause on developing color technology that comes from the government because it's not stable enough, right? So they decide that once television is going to be mass produced as a technology and that people are going to buy TV sets, that there has to be broadcast standards, right? And it's easier to stabilize the standards for black and white broadcast. And so most of the TVs sold through the late 1950s really are like engineered primarily for black and white reception. So in the 1960s, they start to regulate a little better and like the technology becomes stable so that they can standardize color broadcast from networks to receivers, your TV in your house. And that's really when people start to buy color TVs. And once people start to buy color TVs, things are broadcast more and more in color. And eventually Dark Shadows switches to color. It's on the air for like 10 years or 13 years or something like that. Ridiculous. So early on, of course, it's not uncommon for things to be shot in black and white like Dark Shadows was. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the 1960s is just this weird era where you'll even have shows that are shot in color, but will have to also, like, all that coloration and the gradation of the color will have to be by the cinematographer working on the TV show, readable in black and white. So for instance, like if you needed to, what's a clear way to do this? Y'all watch WandaVision?
Yeah, it was great.
Are you familiar with WandaVision? Okay, so the early part of that show, and I know that's only because I have a friend who worked with some of the people doing post on that, so doing the editing and color grading and everything. For the early part of that show, when the episodes were in black and white, they had to really consider like Vision's face paint. And the reason they had to think through that is because red, if you shoot in black and white, reads as black. And the thing you don't want a Marvel show to have is a main character who looks like he's in blackface, right? And so as a part of all of this 1960s transference into color technology, every time they shoot a show in color to broadcast in color, they have to consider the fact that like at least half the country is going to be receiving it in black and white, and therefore make sure that everything reads on black and white as something that's differentiated. So that it's not just everybody wearing black or everybody wearing white and that sort of thing. But it standardizes pretty quickly. It also leads to really weird situations where like Bewitched, for example, that we watched a few weeks back, the first season of that show was shot and aired in black and white. And then the second through sixth season was shot and aired in color. But since the rest of the show was shot in color, they actually went back and colorized officially the first season. Like the studio went back and did it, so that when it was sold as a syndication package later, all the episodes looked the same, as opposed to, you know, people tuning in at 6 p.m. after the news or something on their local station and going like, why is this rerun of Bewitched in black and white? It was a color show. So it's just all these weird things happening for a lot of different reasons.
Right, yeah, and I was gonna ask about like because the Star Trek series had a lot of color and it was very, very, very bright. And how like if there was any troubles with them trying to air shows to the, I mean, probably most of the population that didn't have colorized TVs.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it was just all a consideration that you had to think like half the people weren't capable of receiving color reception just because the tech wasn't in their TV set, right? So they hadn't upgraded to a color set or they hadn't modified it. And a lot of that, I think, you know, is for something like Star Trek, there's kind of like two reasons that they're doing bold primary colors. One is like you want in that genre, I think, a very vibrant, bright color scheme. And also like Star Trek was thought of by the network as primarily a show that would be aimed towards like children and teens. And like they did not anticipate that adults would care at all about it. So even though Gene Roddenberry didn't create the show as a kid's show, that's how they thought about it, right? Because it's like, oh, it's space exploration and sci-fi. So it was kind of like them thinking about like pulp 1930s sci-fi comics and stuff, right?
Right.
Like Buck Rogers. So yeah. Okay. Any final thoughts on Dark Shadows? We can just move into this week's material. So we got a little bit of time left. All right. So let's talk about Mary Tyler Moore. Big, highly influential show. It ran, I think, 122 episodes or something like that. It had three spinoffs, really, although one takes place after the run of the show, but two that were running concurrent. So Rhoda and Phyllis both had their own sitcom spinoff of Mary Tyler Moore several seasons into the show. Both of them return back to like where they are. So Rhoda returns to New York. Phyllis returns to Minneapolis. I can't remember wherever she's from. Another place in the Midwest. But it was also kind of the first big independent production to benefit directly from the Feinstein rules, meaning that, you know, the network itself, for a number of reasons, could not have a financial interest in its primetime programming. So these independent producers like MTM Productions, which made the Mary Tyler Moore Show, started to have more influence over primetime programming. And that's really, as I've explained in the lecture, where primetime storytelling starts to open up a whole lot in the early mid 70s. And then through the mid 80s to take on more real world issues. Sitcoms become more like workforce based rather than kind of domestic family situations. They start to directly address issues like race. But I'm curious, y'all's experiences watching Mary Tyler Moore now, alongside something like Sanford and Son, as a contemporary audience, like, are you able to see over the past few weeks, as we've been watching more and more stuff, like these transitional moments? Do they make any sense to y'all? Kind of like what it is Mary Tyler Moore is doing. And there's like this whole, you know, like we're watching 4 shows, right, this week. But there's a whole like universe of things happening on network television that's, you know, at the time is really exciting. Because you're really seeing television open up in a way that it had not before. So I'm curious your experiences this week watching Mary Tyler Moore and Sanford and Son, and how they tackle issues of gender and race and sexism and misogyny kind of head on. Yeah. Any thoughts on any of this stuff? What did y'all think about Mary Tyler Moore and or Sanford and Son? Had y'all seen either show before? Do y'all know who Mary Tyler Moore was before this week? Maybe heard the name. She was on the Dick Van Dyke Show. She was Dick Van Dyke's wife on the Dick Van Dyke Show. So she had been like a TV star before. And it's really like with this, because it's an independent production, she can have more of a voice in the production itself as a woman. And so the show really is about kind of her taking ownership of her place in life. And she's not, she's a single woman in her 30s who, has a career or gets a career. She's very early on in the episode we watched into her career, but she's working for this news station, right? Yeah. It was a big feminist moment for TV at this period as well.
I'm watching New Girl right now for the first time, and a lot of the aspects of the Mary Tyler Moore Show reminded me of Jess's experiences in New Girl, of just being a single woman and having to work through careers and relationships. And I think that it's something kind of same with Sanford and Son, is that it's taking real life experiences and not trivializing them or really pouring into stereotypes, but more realizing that these are experiences that people that are this age or this race or gender are living and experiencing with these characters, so they're able to really identify with them.
Yeah, do y'all agree with that sentiment? Do y'all have any pushback to any of that? I think by and large, I think that's exactly correct. Sanford and Son, I think, gets a little bit of pushback because there is stereotype involved. And unlike on the Mary Tyler Moore Show, when there's stereotype, there's no one on the creative side that necessarily has the ability to push back or to do anything about it. So it's a little different, I think. But Sanford and Son really is kind of the first big extremely successful Black sitcom that has a huge crossover audience. Black audiences watch it, white audiences watch it, and it's kind of structured around the one of the lead actors, Red Fox, kind of had been a star for a long time. He started as a stand-up comedian in the 1950s when stand-up was not really a thing. People would do it, but you would open for bands or things like that. You didn't have a club circuit you would go to outside of, Jewish comics would go to the Catskills, what they would call the Borscht Belt. They'd perform at all the summer camps up there and do their shtick. Black comics would open for blues acts in the Chitlin circuit down south. And Red Fox came out of that. But he was, along with people like Lenny Bruce, somebody who had really put a lot of time in as a comedian and seen that art form develop in a very specific way, to where in the mid 70s, for example, you had people like Richard Pryor or George Carlin who could get out on stage and, say whatever they wanted to and not get arrested. Red Fox, he was notorious for what they used to call party records. Party records were called that because you would buy them kind of illegally at your record store, but they were recordings of bawdy blue language stand-up acts, and you would play them at parties, right? So you'd have a bunch of cocktails hanging around, listen to the record, and everybody would laugh. So the show's at least built around that. He had a comedic persona as a cantankerous older guy, even when he was much younger. So you do have some of that. How did y'all feel about Sanford and Son in general? Anybody want to chime in? Anybody who hasn't spoken yet today have thoughts? Go ahead, Kennedy.
I thought it was really funny, and some of it might be because they reminded me of my father's and his father's relationship. So it was very entertaining to me. But I think one thing that was interesting is that, you were talking about the racial crossover, when you're thinking about the difference in financial demographics. So having them to be a lower income family could be something that was appealing to people across different races. So the whole scene with them at the auction was just hilarious. So I think that that's kind of why the show was successful, but I overall enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah, it is doing something different with class and race than I think we've seen before, and I think generally was considered new. And it's interesting because when they made that show, it's an adaptation of a British show that they kind of took the premise from, which is like a older guy and his son have like a junkyard, right? And they kind of just bring that over here, and they make the lead characters black, which of course I think points to some of the problems in the production. But I think you're right to point out that, like, because there is this circumstance of class that is being addressed in some way, that both allows, like, because they're actually able to talk about the class aspect of it and money and things like that, it alleviates a little bit of the tension that might be there just from the production circumstances of making those characters black when they originally were white in the British show, but also does have that crossover appeal a little bit. It also, and there's a lot of really interesting reading on this if y'all continue studying TV as you go through the program. There's a lot of really interesting writing on, how sitcoms as a form allow for conversation to happen within them and kind of nudge towards social change and nudge toward bringing up like we've talked a little bit about this before. And so I think because Fred Sanford and Lamont Sanford are kind of poorer, they don't pose a threat to like the domestic sitcom space, and they don't pose a threat to the working sitcom space of kind of the more affluent versions of that, like we might get with something like Mary Tyler Moore, if that makes sense. So it allows them to do a little different in that form than they might otherwise if they were trying to do a different version of a sitcom, maybe. I don't know. Any other thoughts on Sanford and Son? We might make it out on time today. All right, so let's talk about the last two, Mission Impossible and Carol Burnett. I don't imagine, as I said in the intro video this week, that either of these shows were that familiar to you. I know you know of Mission Impossible, but mostly because it's a huge movie franchise at this point. First, I'm curious about your thoughts on that show and how it went with or against your expectations of what Mission Impossible was or is. And then let's talk about Carol Burnett for a little bit, and Flip Wilson, who's an important talent. He's like one of the first Black comics that had his own show. He had his own sketch comedy show as well, but it's not streaming anywhere, so I couldn't show it. I would prefer to show you. Flip Wilson's show is great. Carol Burnett's great too, but I would prefer to show you Flip Wilson. It's just not available anywhere, or wasn't as of last week. So thoughts on Mission Impossible, anybody? Was it exciting? Thrilling? Reminded you of the show Leverage. I haven't seen Leverage. In what way are you thinking there, Maddie?
The Leverage is basically like it's a group of people working to con the rich and give the money to the poor. So they kind of do the same whole like setup in which they trick people into like scenarios to give them money. So it was kind of like they do the whole spy setup type thing that Mission Impossible is doing, but just less in a spy kind of way and more of a con kind of way. So I've just watched a lot more Leverage, and so it kind of reminded me of that and that whole like tricking people into thinking they're one place when they're really in another, and like just tricking people in general kind of reminded me of that.
That's interesting, because I think that's certainly one legacy that the Mission Impossible series has on television, is like that it does allow for these kind of team-based shows. Like in the 80s, we get another version of it with something like the A-Team, right, with Mr. T and all the guys. But also I think like some of these procedurals that we have now, shows like Leverage, and even some of the crime shows where this team has to figure out something, right? Now they're all like forensic based as opposed to espionage kind of thing. But I think you can trace a little bit of the lineage there too. And in the 70s, there's a lot of these team-based shows, and it's really kind of a pop culture moment, too, coming out of the late 60s, where spy culture is really big. So you have not only shows like Mission Impossible, but you've got Man from Uncle. You have you know, the the female version of that with Charlie's Angels, which the network executives like really did have extremely sexist views on. Like they would call it Jiggle TV. And kind of the shows coming out of like it was a programming thing they would talk about. It's not me saying it's Jiggle TV. I just want to clarify. But you know, so there's all these like absurd things going on behind all of this as well. Yeah, anyway, a little off topic, but so going off of that, how did y'all feel about Carol Burnett's show when you finally sat down to it? Had y'all heard of Carol Burnett before? Maybe if you have, it'd be like somewhat recently they did kind of a reunion thing and like a big honor for her, and she's won lots of Lifetime Achievement Awards over the recent like 10 years or so. You know, because she's old at this point. Most of the people that were on her show have died, like Harvey Korman died some time ago. But she was a big deal. It's of this moment where, oh, that's interesting, Bella. Yeah, it's of this moment where shows like SNL were not really there yet. Like that's late 70s. But sketch shows were a major thing in the early 70s and late 60s. So you had like not only Carol Burnett, but you'd have like the Smothers Brothers, who were massive stars, and actually got into a lot of trouble because they were the only people on network television who every single week would come out against and speak out against the Vietnam War, beginning in like 1966. So pretty early on, actually. So then Sonny and Cher had like a variety show that ran forever and ever, like 4 or 5 seasons, and then Cher did 5 seasons on her own or something like that. So yeah, right. SNL kind of takes that and then really just makes it a late night show. So they can be a little more topical, a little more adult, and a little more absurd in dark ways sometimes. If you watch the first couple of seasons of SNL, there's some really like good stuff you would have never seen on any of these sketch shows. Manny says that they thought the skit was really funny. I'm glad. I hope that the Mission Impossible episode helped make it a little funnier, because I can imagine this is what we ran into last year. Is I showed the same episode, and then everybody just kind of was like, "I've never seen Mission Impossible before." So like half the jokes were just gone, you know. So I hope that helped. But I wanted y'all to have a taste of like what this show was like and what these variety sketch shows were like at the time, because we will get to SNL and we will get to talking about some of these procedurals very soon, like Mission Impossible. And so I just wanted y'all to get kind of a sampler of everything for this week. Before I move on to final announcements on stuff, any lingering questions or thoughts on any of the shows this week? Anything that popped in your head about the material for the class we'd been reading or watching in lecture videos? Anything at all? If you have the question, I guarantee somebody else does. I know I say that all the time, but it's true. I get the same emails after I say that. So, okay, a couple of things. So, voice threads again. We're doing something a little different this week. Hop on there. You just need to talk through one. You might be settled, right? A show and something that interests you about that show that you want to explore, so we can start working toward that. I've got my thing on there so you can see what I'll be working on as we work through our final projects together. You don't have to go and find anything and upload it yourself. You can just comment on the first slide if you want to. But if you want to go out and find something, or you've already found something that you find interesting, feel free to share that. And then also, if you go through and listen to other people's, you don't have to listen to everybody's, but check through randomly and see what might be there. And then maybe offer some feedback. Feel free to offer feedback on mine. I I just think it'll be fun to kind of start having a discussion about the possibilities with this stuff. And so I say this on my slide, but like I'm really interested in the blind spots that I'm not focused on in my own research, because I sort of know what I want to talk about because I've been thinking about needing to do it, which is also part of the the impetus for like doing this with y'all, is like it makes me generate work that I should be doing anyway. But I want y'all to like listen to what I'm talking about and just like ask questions. Be like, hey, what do you mean by this? Or like, I'm interested in knowing more about this thing that you're talking, like, whatever. Okay. And you don't have to comment on anybody else's. I'm just saying, feel free, be nice, be generous. I don't think anybody in here will be like, oh man, this sucks or whatever. You can say it on mine, I don't care. But anyway, so because that is up a little late and because I want y'all to just spend some time thinking through it, it's going to be due Wednesday. I have it set to be due on Wednesday next week at like 10 or midnight or something like that. But I'll undo that due date so that y'all can still get it in. I just want it to be in so I can listen to them and think through them with y'all. On that note, feel free to go and submit to other voice threads if you have not. Okay, at least get your partial credit in there. You don't want to have a zero. There are a few of you who have just missed one or two for whatever reason. I don't really care. It doesn't matter, but you can go back in and do them. So you can, just when you're in voice thread, click on them, do the assignment, get it done. You're not going to miss out on many points, a couple each that you're late, but that's fine. So those of you who are out there, you know who you are, just go in and do it. Get your points in, okay? The other thing I want you to just have on your radar is that next week is when your over 50 interviews are due. Okay, so start thinking about, if you haven't already, like who you're going to talk to, jot down some quick questions. The parameters are real easy. 10 questions. I don't care like what structure they're in or anything like that. You can deviate. So if you get down a rabbit hole after asking one or two questions that's more interesting than your other questions, feel free to keep exploring that. And then you're going to just write it up like a little profile. It's not even, you don't have to go question one, answer, question two, answer. You can do it that way if it's easy to structure for you, but just write it up. Okay. It's fun. I know it seems like something you like, oh God, it's work, but it really is fun, like to do this work, especially if you're interviewing relatives or like close friends of the family and stuff like that, because your experiences watching TV are quite different. As you probably already talked about, like Maddie with her dad and watching Star Trek, they're quite different generationally, because their experience of watching TV is from, 20 years before y'all were born most of the time. Or if they're earlier than that, my grandparents, like, were in their 50s before I was born, in their 60s before I was born, some of them. So you'll have fun doing it, is what I'm saying. Like, it's always a fun conversation just to have with people. That's it. I'm going to stop the recording.